What if some of the most influential video games were built on philosophical ideas? Whether the developers were consciously aware of it or not. Or, to turn the question around, what if philosophy can be used as a lens through which we understand the evolution of game design? And why, of all things, would there be a conceptual line connecting Ultima IV from the mid-80s to Ark Raiders, an extraction shooter that created a buzz in 2025? That's what I would like to think through with you today. Now, this isn't an entirely new idea. There are books that pair games and philosophy all the time. Warcraft and philosophy, Dark Souls and philosophy, and so on. So, of course, philosophical concepts can be applied to games. But I'm interested in something slightly different. I sometimes get the feeling that if you look at the history of games closely enough, it begins to mirror the history of philosophical thinking itself. Not perfectly, not deliberately, but in patterns. Let us begin with Ultima IV, one of my all-time favorite games and, historically speaking, one of the most influential RPGs ever made. If you look at the early Ultima titles and even the Calabeth before them, they follow a familiar pattern. Defeat the evil wizard, confront his apprentice, eliminate the next great threat. It's archetypical fantasy structure. And then, with Ultima IV, something shifts. In the mid-1980s, there was increasing anxiety about video games corrupting young minds, especially children and teenagers. Not unlike the moral panic around heavy metal or rap music at the time. Richard Garriott had received letters from concerned parents. The cover of Ultima III, with its menacing demon, did little to reassure them. So, when Ultima IV was released, first entry in what would later be called the Age of Enlightenment trilogy, players were confronted with something unexpected. Yes, you still fought monsters. Yes, you still explored dangerous dungeons. But your real objective was not to defeat an ultimate villain. Your goal was to become the Avatar, to embody 8 virtues: honesty, compassion, valor, justice, humility, sacrifice, spirituality, and honor. That was a bold move, and it worked. Instead of asking you to save the world through violence alone, the game quietly asked something else. Can you become virtuous? You couldn't just grind your way to victory. You had to act in accordance with these virtues. If you lied, it had consequences. If you boasted, people reacted differently. If you slaughtered fleeing creatures, your compassion suffered. If you ran from combat too often, your courage diminished. Progress was tied to moral conduct, and that's where Aristotle comes in. Aristotle's virtue ethics aren't primarily about rules or consequences. They're about character, about who you become through repeated action. Virtue, for Aristotle, isn't something you declare, it's something you practice. You become courageous by acting courageously. You cultivate justice by behaving justly. Over time, habits shape character, and character shapes destiny. He also speaks of the golden mean, virtue as a balance between excess and deficiency. And when you look at Ultima IV through that lens, it's hard not to see the parallel. The game doesn't simply check whether you followed instructions. It gradually conditions you to reflect on your behavior. It doesn't just ask, did you obey the rules? It implicitly asks, what kind of person are you becoming? Now, I first played the game when I was around 11 or 12. At that point in life, I already knew, in a general sense, that stealing was wrong and honesty was good. School and family had made that clear. But humility, sacrifice, compassion towards enemies, those weren't abstract virtues anymore. They became gameplay decisions. I distinctively remember sparing fleeing monsters, not because I necessarily wanted to, but because I had internalized the system, because I was trying to be the Avatar. Did that shape me? I can say for certain, human development is more complicated than that. But I do believe those hours in Britannia were more than just filling meters on a status screen. They were rehearsals of ethical behavior in a simulated world. Now, let's fast forward a few decades and the tone changes. In Dark Souls, you aren't sent out to rekindle the flame and prolong the Age of Fire. At least, that's what you're told. But the world of Dark Souls is layered with ambiguity. Hints suggest that this narrative may not be complete, or may not even be truthful. If you attack Guinevere, the radiant illusion shatters. The majestic brightness of Analondo fades into darkness, and suddenly the story you thought you understood begins to unravel. You are no longer simply pursuing the good, you are questioning who defined it. And this shift feels much closer to Nietzsche. Nietzsche argued that moral systems are not timeless truths handed down from above. They are created, often by those in power. Values are constructed and they serve interests. In Dark Souls, the gods define the narrative, observe the Age of Fire. But as you dig deeper, you begin to wonder, who benefits from that age continuing? Is light inherently good, or is it merely the dominant perspective? When you are given the final choice to link the fire or let it fade, the game does not offer moral clarity. It doesn't label one ending as virtuous and the other as evil. It doesn't fully explain the consequences either. The Age of Fire benefits the gods. The Age of Darkness may benefit humanity, or perhaps that too is a lie. Unlike Ultima IV, Dark Souls doesn't train you to become virtuous in a predefined framework. It confronts you with ambiguity and leaves you alone with your interpretation. So, if Ultima IV asks, what kind of person are you becoming? Dark Souls asks, who told you what good means in the first place? And then we move one step further. EVE Online doesn't question morality, it largely removes it. Since 2003, EVE has developed a reputation for ruthless player interaction, espionage, betrayal, economic manipulation, corporate sabotage that can unfold over months or years. You can be scammed, ambushed, betrayed by someone you trusted. Game systems don't enforce virtue, they enforce mechanics. Once you're undock, you're vulnerable. There is high security space, yes, but nowhere is entirely safe. And because there is no overarching moral system dictating behavior, players are free to pursue their own interests, whether cooperative or predatory. This is where Hobbes becomes relevant. Hobbes described the state of nature as a condition without central authority. In such a state, life becomes uncertain. Trust is fragile. Fear and self-interest dominate. EVE often feels like that, and yet something fascinating happens inside that apparent chaos. Players form corporations, alliances, power blocks that function almost like digital states. They negotiate treaties, they patrol territory, they enforce internal codes of conduct. Order emerges, not because the game demands virtue, but because survival demands structure. So EVE becomes a kind of a laboratory for the social contract. What Hobbes theorized, that people, in the absence of authority, will eventually create structures to escape perpetual insecurity, plays out organically in its universe. It is not morality imposed from above, it is order negotiated from below. Now, finally, let's consider Arc Raiders. Unlike EVE, it doesn't unfold over years of political maneuvering. It compresses similar dynamics into 30-minute matches. Every encounter with another player is a micro-negotiation. You see someone, they see you. Neither of you knows the other's intention. You can signal peace, but is trust rational? Hobbes would argue that without enforcement, trust is always risky. Interestingly, Embark's CEO described Arc Raiders as almost like a social experiment after a discussion with a neurology professor who suggested studying the behaviors the game triggers in players. That description feels remarkably accurate, because what you see in Arc Raiders isn't scripted morality, it's human behavior under pressure. Some players revive strangers, Some immediately exploit them. Some cooperate until the extraction point and then turn on their temporary allies. What Eve allows to evolve over years, trust, betrayal, alliances, reputation, Arc Raiders condenses into intense, short-lived interactions. It is pretty much Hobbes with a timer running. So, where does all that leave us? Ultima IV attempted to cultivate virtue. Dark Souls destabilized moral certainty. Eve simulated emergent order in a near-anarchic environment. Arc Raiders test trust in compressed, high-risk encounters. Are games becoming less moral? Or are they becoming more honest about the tension between cooperation and self-interest? And perhaps the most intriguing part is this. Even in an Hobbesian setting like Arc Raiders, some players still choose to act generously, virtuously. They revive strangers. They refuse to betray, even when betrayal would be rational. Maybe Aristotle never truly disappeared. Maybe virtue persists, not because the system enforces it, but because individuals decide to practice it. And that might be the most fascinating evolution of all. If you made it this far, thank you for thinking through this with me. I'd genuinely love to hear what you think. Are games philosophical by design? Or do we simply project philosophy onto them? And have games changed or have we? See you next time.